cheating queens, cuckolded kings, and illegitimate heirs. Monarchs claim the throne on their pedigree. And because crowns have nearly always been passed down male lines, this means their paternity. This poses a bit of a problem, for while a woman can be relatively certain that the baby which emerges from her body is genetically hers, her husband has no such guarantee. As the saying goes, mommy's baby, daddy's maybe. Kings had no limitations on their sexual exploits and often took dozens of mistresses. But because of the vital need to ensure a legitimate succession, a queen was required to be completely faithful, preserving her womb as a sacred vessel for the king's seed alone. But just because queens were supposed to be unerring didn't mean they always were. And in some cases, the king was physically or psychologically incapable of consummating the royal marriage, or he was just gay. And the queen was forced into adultery in order to save the succession. Let's examine 4 cases from history where queens are suspected to have cuckolded their kings and produced illegitimate heirs to the throne. Juana of Portugal and the Golden Turkey Baster. King Enrique IV of Castile was an impressively large man with golden hair and dreamy blue eyes. This contrasted poorly with his large yellow teeth, crooked nose, and repulsive body odor. He was painfully shy, awkward, and prone to depression. When he was 15 and still Prince of Asturias, he was wed to 16-year-old Blanca of Navarre, daughter of the King of Aragon. On their wedding night, the court tucked them into bed with great fanfare, and the young couple were expected to do their duty to seal a peace treaty and secure the succession. No pressure. 3 scribes waited just outside the bed curtains to record any sounds and show the bloody sheets to dozens of courtiers eagerly waiting outside the door. But the candlelit bedchamber remained eerily silent. Enrique's father hoped that in time his son would mature enough to do his duty. But months and years passed, and the crown prince and princess remained virgins. After 13 years of unsuccessful marriage, Enrique inherited the throne and the political winds shifted. An alliance with Aragon was no longer advantageous, so he went to the Pope and claimed that Blanca had used witchcraft to make him impotent. She was forced to submit to a humiliating examination, which confirmed that she was still a virgin. The king also brought in local sex workers, who testified that he had been able to perform with them, so it was clearly Blanca who was the problem. The king got his annulment, and Blanca was sent back to her father, who imprisoned her for failing to please her husband. Enrique contracted a new marriage treaty with Portugal, and Princess Juana was sent to him. She was a beauty with black hair, captivating dark eyes, and flirtatious charm. She was repulsed by her hulking husband, but remained silent as she slid into bed on their wedding night. The king had fortified himself with the Viagra of the time, broth of bull's testicles mixed with powdered porcupine quill. He lumbered into bed next to his beautiful bride, and nothing happened. Royal doctors later reported that Enrique had a congenitally misshapen member, which was thin and weak at the base with a huge head, and he was unable to have an erection. There were also reports that he preferred the company of men. But he desperately needed an heir. The king was not willing to give up, so he came up with a novel solution: artificial insemination. Such practices were banned by the Catholic Church, but had been performed by Jewish and Muslim physicians since antiquity. A Jewish doctor managed to extract a small amount of watery seed from the king, which he inserted by means of a pipette into the queen, who was lying in bed with her legs elevated. Miraculously, it worked. Juana became pregnant. Enrique was thrilled, but courtiers snickered behind his back. They had seen handsome Beltrán de la Cueva entering the queen's bedchamber at night. The baby princess, who was christened Juana after her mother, was the spitting image of Beltrán, and courtiers began calling her La Beltraneja. Queen Juana might have gotten away with her deception had she not ruffled so many feathers with her haughty attitude, intrigues, and bold displays of her décolletage. One of her enemies clued the king in, and he was devastated. He banished his wife to the castle of the Bishop of Fonseca. Juana promptly began an affair with the bishop's nephew and gave birth to 2 sons, Pedro and Andres, without the need for a golden turkey baster. The former queen was now so notorious that she had little choice but to retire to a convent. Nobles broke out in rebellion and forced the king to name his brother, Alfonso, as heir to the throne. He agreed under the condition that his brother marry Juana, whom he hoped was still his daughter. But Alfonso died suddenly at 14, probably of plague, though it was whispered that former Queen Juana had poisoned him, so her daughter wouldn't have to share the throne. Enrique's sister, Isabel, was an ambitious and wise 17-year-old. She met with her brother and they made a compromise that Isabella would end the rebellion in exchange for being named heir. When Enrique died at 49, some lords supported Juana and others Isabel. Juana's uncle, King Alfonso V of Portugal, invaded Castile, kidnapped and married 13-year-old Juana. Isabel married Blanca's brother, King Fernando of Aragon. The 2 husbands faced off at the Battle of Toro, and Ferdinand was victorious, securing the throne of Castile for Isabel. Together, Isabel and Fernando became one of Europe's most famous power couples. They conquered the Muslim kingdom of Granada and launched both Christopher Columbus's expedition to the New World and the Spanish Inquisition. Spain was united under their descendants. Meanwhile, Juana la Beltraneja was abandoned by her husband and dumped in a convent. She died there at 68. Though there are numerous near-contemporary reports of King Enrique's impotence and Princess Juana's illegitimacy, some historians have argued that she might actually have been his true daughter. Many of the reports were modified under the influence of Isabella, who had a strong interest in advertising Juana's illegitimacy. Either way, the princess with questionable paternity did not end up on the throne. But in our next account, the legitimacy of an heir calls the entire line of the English and British monarchs into question. Cecily Neville and the Arrow in the Rose Garden. In 1424, 13-year-old Richard, Duke of York, was betrothed to 9-year-old Cecily Neville. He was an orphan, his mother had died in childbirth, and his father was beheaded for plotting against his second cousin, King Henry V. The powerful Earl of Westmoreland was granted the young duke's wardship, which meant he had control over his vast fortune and could wed him to one of his own daughters. The Earl had 22 children, so he needed to find a lot of aristocratic in-laws. Richard and Cecily had grown up like brother and sister, and they were in no rush to get physical. Plus, Richard was appointed commander of the English forces in the 100 Years' War, so he was often away on the battlefield. It took 10 years of marriage before Cecily delivered their first child, a daughter named Anne. 2 years later, a son, Henry, followed, but he died shortly after birth. Then a third child arrived, Edward. The circumstances of his birth has been one of the most enduring mysteries of the Plantagenet dynasty. Edward was born on April 28, 1442. If he was a full-term baby of 40 weeks gestation, he would have been conceived around July 23, 1441. However, from July 14th to August 21st, his supposed father was far away defending Pontoise, France. There have long been rumors that Cecily had an affair with a nameless archer, who was Edward's true biological father. The baby had a quiet baptism in a side chapel, while his younger brother, Edmund, had a spectacular public ceremony in the cathedral. This further suggests that there was something about Edward's birth his family wanted to hush up. While Edward grew up, his third cousin, King Henry VI, suffered mental illness. He lost his memory, control of his body, and the ability to speak. Richard, Duke of York, seized the opportunity to become regent. The Duke's side of the family, the Yorks, waged war against the King's side, the Lancasters. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, made a valiant effort to fight for her husband and her young son, Edward of Westminster. She commanded the battle in Wakefield, during which Richard of York and his son Edmund were slain. The Duke's supposed eldest son, Edward, now a dashing and charismatic 18-year-old, became the new leader of the Yorks. He was remarkably tall at 6'4" and had golden hair, while his father and brothers were short and dark. Edward was not content to be regent. He defeated the Lancasters at Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and he had himself proclaimed King Edward IV. The king fell in love with a beautiful widow, Elizabeth Woodville. She was English, and the king ruffled many feathers by choosing her over a foreign princess. His own mother, Cecily, was especially infuriated. According to one account, she flew into a rage and threatened to testify publicly that her son was conceived in adultery and was therefore not worthy of the honor of kingship. Edward stuck by Elizabeth, and they had 10 children. Among the noses put out of joint by the rise of the Woodvilles was that of Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence. He was a bit of a baddie and is credited with personally beheading Henry VI's 17-year-old son, Edward, after the Battle of Tewkesbury. A few weeks later, the corpse of Henry VI was carried out of the Tower of London. He was probably murdered on Edward's orders, thus bringing that succession line to a bloody end. George told anyone who would listen that his brother was a bastard. Of course, that meant that he would be the rightful king, and he actually plotted to overthrow his brother. Edward condemned George to the Tower, where he was drowned in a vat of wine. Edward thought he could rely on his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, so when he died suddenly from illness at 40, his 12-year-old son, now King Edward V, was entrusted to his uncle Richard. He escorted the young king and his little brother to the Tower, where they would be safe until the coronation. But Uncle Richard betrayed his brother's trust. He found a priest who swore that the princes were illegitimate and had himself crowned Richard III. Interestingly, he didn't bring up his brother's parentage at all. The young princes in the Tower were never seen again. Richard didn't get to enjoy his ill-gotten crown for long. Henry Tudor had the most competitive claim to the throne on the Lancastrian side. He was a descendant of John of Gaunt, who was the older brother of Richard III's ancestor, Edmund of York. The problem was that Henry's line was born of John's mistress, Catherine Swynford, and was therefore illegitimate. Still, Henry Tudor raised an army and defeated and killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. He was crowned Henry VII. He legitimized his claim and brought an end to the War of the Roses by marrying Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Their son, Henry VIII, and all English monarchs after claimed descent through these reconciled royal lines. But if Edward IV was illegitimate, does that mean every monarch from the Tudors to King Charles III has made a false claim on the throne? In the 2004 documentary, Britain's Real Monarch, Tony Robinson determined that the throne should have gone to George, Duke of Clarence. His only surviving child, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was considered a threat by Henry VIII, who ordered her beheaded in the Tower of London. Tony traced Margaret's line all the way to the man he claimed was the rightful king of the UK, Michael Abney Hastings, Earl of Loudoun, who had immigrated to Australia. Michael died in 2012, so his son, Simon, would be the rightful monarch today. But how sure are we that Edward IV really was illegitimate? It has been verified that Richard, Duke of York, was away from Cecily for 5 weeks around the time of Edward's conception. But he could have been conceived either on the eve of his father's departure, which would mean that he was 2 weeks overdue, or in celebration of his return, making him just 4 weeks early. Cecily had followed him to France and was just 96 kilometers away in Rouen, so it's also very possible that they met in the middle. Some have argued that if a royal baby was premature, it would have been recorded, but this may explain why Edward didn't have a spectacular baptism. If he was unwell, then his parents would have baptized him as quickly as possible with minimal fuss, in case he died. It also seems unlikely that Cecily, who was known as the Proud, would have stooped to sleeping with a common archer. Her supposed outburst against her son's marriage was recorded only as gossip, and it seems preposterous that a royal lady would be willing to publicly shame herself by admitting adultery. The aspersions of Edward's brother, George, were motivated by his own ambitions and can be chalked up to political mudslinging. In the end, there is fascinating evidence that Edward was illegitimate, but it is all circumstantial. The only way we can really know is if Edward's bones were genetically analyzed and compared to his relatives. His brother Richard was dug up in a car park in 2012, and his genome is on file. But Edward's tomb in St. George's Chapel hasn't been opened since the 1700s, and there are no plans to unearth him. Whether Edward IV was the legitimate son of Richard, Duke of York, or sired by a nameless archer, it doesn't really affect the claims of the modern British royal family. Edward was undoubtedly a descendant of Edward III through his mother, regardless of who his father was. And, more importantly, he claimed the throne not because he was the rightful king via primogeniture. Everyone knew he was usurping the throne from Henry VI and his son Edward of Westminster. Edward IV claimed the throne by the right of conquest, thus pressing the reset button on the dynastic line. 400 years earlier, William the Conqueror, who was undoubtedly illegitimate, did the same, but no one questioned the claims of his descendants. Sophia Magdalena of Denmark and the royal sex ed instructor. Sophia Magdalena was the daughter of King Frederick V of Denmark and Norway, and of Princess Louise of Great Britain, daughter of George II. At 5, she was betrothed to the heir to the Swedish throne. Sophia was given a strict religious education and trained to be an obedient wife. When she was 20, she made the short voyage across the North Sea to her new homeland. Her groom greeted her on the shore, and, fearing that she would tumble off the gangplank, he reached out his hand to steady her. The kind gesture was the talk of the court, and many expected the newlyweds to quickly fill the palace nursery. But a year passed with no royal babies. Her brother, Christian VII, asked a Swedish artist who was visiting his court how his sister was. The painter replied, "As happy as any woman who has been married 3 years and yet remains a virgin." Courtiers noticed how much more interest Prince Gustav paid to his male companions than his wife. Sophia didn't inspire much affection. She was shy and didn't fit into her husband's flamboyant, spontaneous, fun-loving court. Gustav described her as cold as ice. And his mother, Louisa Ulrika, who had wanted him to marry one of her Prussian relatives, actively kept them apart and badmouthed her daughter-in-law. Gustav loved theater and acted with his courtiers in performances. His timid spouse could think of nothing more terrifying. Still, she tried to please him by appearing in a few productions as a background character. Once she paid a surprise visit on her husband at his private retreat. Upon entering his bedchamber, she found him lounging with a naked actor. There were rumors that Gustav indulged in orgies and wandered city parks at night, propositioning young men. 5 years into their marriage, he became King Gustav III. He was under even more pressure to secure the succession, but he still didn't want to sleep with his wife. He arranged for his younger brother, Karl, to marry a beautiful German princess, Hedwig of Holstein-Gottorp, but she suffered several miscarriages and had no surviving children. Meanwhile, the king organized a coup to take back power from the Reichstag, or parliament. He claimed absolute power, infuriating his people. They were edging towards rebellion, and it was easier to topple a king who didn't have an heir. Suddenly, after 11 years of unhappy marriage, Queen Sophia delivered a healthy baby boy, Crown Prince Gustav Adolf. But many at court noted how close the queen was to the handsome Finnish count Adolf Fredrik Munch, and it has been suggested that the king ordered his wife to have an affair with the count in order to produce an heir. According to the official report, Gustav was most certainly not homosexual, merely inexperienced. He asked his friend, Munch, to instruct him on how to consummate his marriage. After a bit of sex ed, the instructor waited just outside the queen's bedchamber, while the royal couple put their new knowledge into practice. Apparently things weren't going well, and Munch was called in. In his own records, he recorded that he had to physically touch both the king and queen to get the job done. Some believed this story. Others whispered that Munch probably pushed the inept king aside and finished the job himself. Shortly after the birth of the heir, the count was promoted by the king and given a diamond ring by the queen. It was also noted how much the royal baby resembled the count's other children. Sophia gave birth to a second son, Prince Karl, but he died shortly after birth. After this heartbreak, she bid farewell to Count Munch with a gift of 50,000 riksdaler. Gustav III enhanced his people's hatred by going to war with Russia. While attending a ball at the Royal Opera, he was shot to death by an assassin. His wife's 13-year-old son became Gustav IV Adolf. He continued the war with Russia, and in 1809 he lost Finland, which had been ruled by Sweden for 700 years. The people were furious and deposed him. The throne should have gone to his 10-year-old son, Gustav, but the Riksdag claimed that his disgrace had also lost his descendants the right to rule. This was widely believed to really be based on the long-standing question about his paternity. Gustav's old and childless uncle became Karl XIII, but the Riksdag elected a new crown prince who had no links to the Oldenburg dynasty. A French general and protege of Napoleon Bonaparte, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, was crowned King Karl XIV Johann and established the Bernadotte dynasty, which is still on the Swedish throne today. Hortense du Beauharnais and the Napoleon who wasn't really a Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte had a libido as impressive as his army. While he was on campaign, he sent filthy letters home to his wife, Josephine, meanwhile conducting affairs with the officers' wives who followed his camp. But despite his lust, the little corporal was unable to impregnate his beloved wife, likely because she had suffered a gynecological infection while imprisoned during the French Revolution. But Napoleon had an alternative plan to combine his lineage with Josephine's and produce an heir whom he could mold into an ideal future emperor. Napoleon had a little brother, Louis, who was his protege. Josephine had a daughter, Hortense, from her first marriage. Napoleon ordered Louis and Hortense to marry each other and eagerly waited their Bonaparte-Lepage offspring. Beautiful, cultured, and alluring, Hortense was horrified by her groom. He was awkward and indecisive, and everyone whispered that he would have achieved nothing without nepotism. The couple wed in January, and by October she gave birth to a son, who was named Napoleon Charles. The emperor was delighted and took a keen interest in the boy. This led to rumors that the little prince was the result of an illicit affair between Hortense and her stepfather. 2 more sons followed, Napoleon Louis and Louis Napoleon. Louis Bonaparte claimed them all, but he had doubts about their paternity. He and Hortense barely tolerated each other, and she refused to allow her marital duties to get in the way of her packed calendar of dazzling balls and fashionable salons. She openly flirted with handsome and witty gentlemen, particularly Charles-Joseph, Comte de Fleury. He has long been rumored to be the real father of more than one of Hortense's sons. Napoleon named his brother King of Holland. But his wife refused to leave her friends and lovers in Paris and visited him as little as possible. Sadly, their eldest son, Napoleon Charles, died of croup at the age of 4. Despite burgeoning mental illness, probably bipolar disorder, Louis was a popular king. The Dutch called him Louis the Good. His brother considered this a sign of weakness. He ordered French troops to abandon Louis and allowed the English to invade Holland. Louis was forced to abdicate in favor of his 6-year-old son, Louis Napoleon, and he retired to Austria. Hortense was unfazed and continued her affair with Charles in Paris. She became pregnant for a 4th time, and now there could be no pretense that the baby was her husband's. She had to hide her condition from her stepfather. Despite his own lust, he had no tolerance for impropriety among the women in his family. He punished his sisters for their many affairs, sending their lovers to the front lines. And Hortense was on thin ice. The emperor had recently divorced her mother, Josephine, for her own affairs and for failing to produce an heir. He replaced her with 18-year-old Austrian Grand Duchess Marie-Louise, and she promptly delivered a son. He was also named Napoleon and supplanted Hortense's children as heir to the throne. Hortense concealed her baby bump under a fashionable empire waist gown at baby Napoleon's baptism. She then claimed illness and traveled to a spa in Lake Geneva, where she gave birth to a son, Charles, whom she handed over to the Flois family. After Emperor Napoleon's downfall at Waterloo, Hortense moved to Switzerland. She enjoyed a luxurious life among fashionable French expats, wrote her memoirs, and composed music. Back in France, the Bourbon royal dynasty was restored in 1815, but Bonapartists considered the emperor's only son, Napoleon II, who was living in exile in Vienna, to be the true emperor. However, he died of tuberculosis at 21. Hortense's second son, Napoleon Louis, died of measles at 26. Her third son, Louis Napoleon, rose through the ranks of the Swiss army. He showed talent and seemed to be a chip off his alleged uncle's old block. In 1848, revolutions broke out across Europe, and the Bourbon dynasty was toppled once more. France declared a second republic, and they decided to give the Bonapartes another shot by electing Napoleon's nephew as president. However, the new constitution prevented him from being re-elected, so he threw it out and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. He ruled for 18 years and was a popular leader. He modernized the economy, built railroads, boulevards, and parks. He expanded the French Empire and built the Suez Canal. Napoleon created his illegitimate brother, Duc de Mornay, and appointed their possible father, ambassador to the UK. But he was careful not to associate too closely with them to avoid aspersions about his own paternity. Napoleon joined the UK to beat Russia in the Crimean War, but he faced a humiliating defeat against Prussia and was captured on the battlefield. The French deposed him and declared a third republic. In the end, it didn't matter if Napoleon III and his son, Prince Imperial Louis Napoleon, really had Bonaparte blood, or if they were the illegitimate descendants of the Comte du Flahaut. After them, the French gave up on hereditary monarchy and never had a king or emperor again. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other history videos. You can also join my Patreon to support my work and get early access to all of my multi-part series. Thank you for watching.